I stood in my backyard, tongs in one hand, a cold drink in the other, and the rich, smoky aroma of sizzling barbecue filling the air. It was supposed to be a perfect day, one of those rare golden afternoons where the sun warmed your skin just right, laughter echoed from friends gathered around, and the worries of the world melted away over a grill full of perfectly marinated steaks. But just as I flipped a thick ribeye, my stomach twisted with an all-too-familiar dread. A high-pitched voice sliced through the air like a rusty blade against metal. I didn't even have to turn around. I already knew who it was. That voice, shrill with manufactured authority and dripping with entitlement, belonged to none other than Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA and my personal nightmare. I closed my eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply in a feeble attempt to control the rising frustration clawing at my chest. Every single time. Every time I dared to enjoy my own backyard, Karen found a reason to march over, fists clenched, eyes blazing with righteous fury, ready to ruin my day. I heard the distinct click of her phone camera, followed by her exaggerated gasp, as if she had just walked in on an actual crime scene. Unbelievable, she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Absolutely disgraceful. I turned slowly, forcing a smile even though my jaw ached from the effort. Afternoon, Karen, I said, my voice level, careful. I had learned from experience that any sign of irritation only fueled her ego. Lovely weather, huh? She ignored the pleasantries, her sharp, beady eyes scanning my grill like a detective analyzing a crime scene. I can't believe you're doing this again. I told you last time. This barbecue is unacceptable. I exhaled slowly, feeling my fingers tighten around the tongs. It's a barbecue, Karen. In my own backyard. Where it is explicitly allowed by HOA guidelines, by the way. She gasped theatrically, pressing a hand to her chest as if I had just set an orphanage on fire. Smoke pollution. Noise. Not to mention the blatant disregard for your neighbor's comfort. People are trying to enjoy their homes and you're out here stinking up the entire neighborhood. I bit back a laugh. Karen had once filed a complaint about my smoke pollution when I was literally grilling vegetables. Another time she insisted that my excessive laughing during a backyard get-together was a form of noise disturbance. This woman was relentless. I glanced toward my guests. They had fallen uncomfortably silent, sipping their drinks and shifting in their seats, watching the showdown with the kind of tense fascination reserved for a courtroom drama. Some of them were my neighbors, people who had their own Karen horror stories but were too afraid to stand up to her. Karen pulled out her phone again, snapping more pictures. You know the HOA won't tolerate this, she continued, her voice brimming with smug satisfaction. And neither will I. The police will be here shortly. A cold spike of anger shot through me. The police. It was the third time in 2 months she had weaponized law enforcement against me for something so absurd it bordered on parody. The first time they had arrived expecting some major disturbance, only to find me flipping burgers for a couple of friends. The second time she had called them over a suspicious amount of smoke, which turned out to be nothing more than a few ribs on the grill. Now here we were again, trapped in this ridiculous cycle, as if I were living in some twisted version of Groundhog Day where my only crime was cooking food outdoors. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw something beneath the rage-fueled bravado. Something darker, more insidious. This wasn't about barbecues. This wasn't about smoke or noise or rules. This was about control. Karen wasn't just enforcing HOA guidelines, she was trying to make my life miserable, piece by piece, call by call, until I either fell in line or gave up completely. But I wasn't going to give up. Not this time. The distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet suburban evening, and I saw Karen's lips twitch upward in a small, victorious smirk. My guests exchanged uneasy glances, some muttering under their breath. I could already picture what would happen next. The officers stepping onto my lawn, their tired expressions betraying their frustration at being dragged into another one of Karen's petty complaints. But what Karen didn't know was that this time I was ready. I stepped forward just enough to make her take a reflexive step back. You really called the cops, huh? I said, my voice calm, almost amused. That's dedication. Karen's smirk wavered. You'll see, she snapped. They'll shut this nonsense down once and for all. I gave her a slow, measured nod. Oh, I think we're all going to see something tonight, Karen. Something you definitely won't forget. For the first time since I had known her, Karen hesitated. She wasn't sure what I meant, and that uncertainty flickered across her face like a glitch in a perfect script. The sirens grew louder, closer, until the red and blue lights flashed against the neatly trimmed hedges and perfectly manicured lawns. I turned back to my grill, flipping a steak with deliberate ease. If Karen wanted a battle, she was about to get one. And I wasn't just going to win. I was going to make sure she never tried this again. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of my house, making it look like some kind of crime scene, which in Karen's mind, was exactly what she wanted. The patrol car slowed to a stop in front of my driveway and 2 officers stepped out, their faces already etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with nonsense calls like this. One of them, Officer White, I recognized immediately. He had been here before, just like the last time and the time before that, always called out for the same ridiculous reason. His partner, Officer Bentley, was newer to the force, but I could already see the annoyance in his expression as he looked between Karen and me. Karen, of course, had that self-satisfied, smug little smirk plastered across her face, arms crossed tightly over her chest like she had just cracked the case of the century. Karen wasted no time. She marched up to the officers, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction as if I had just committed a felony. "There he is," she announced dramatically, her voice dripping with self-importance. "The repeat offender. I've told him over and over that these barbecues are a direct violation of HOA rules. The smoke is unbearable. The noise is disruptive. I demand that you take action immediately." Officer White rubbed his temples, looking like he needed a drink. "Ma'am, we've been over this. The HOA permits barbecues within designated hours. We've responded to your calls multiple times and every time, we've found him to be in compliance." He turned toward me, giving me a look that was half apology, half exasperation. "Stephen, I assume nothing's changed?" I shrugged, gesturing toward my grill. Same setup as always, same regulations, same Karen throwing a fit. I could see some of my guests trying not to laugh, watching the exchange like an impromptu comedy show. But I wasn't laughing. Not really. Because as much as I wanted to brush this off as another one of Karen's pathetic attempts to control me, I knew what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to shut down my barbecue. She was trying to wear me down, make me feel like my own home wasn't mine anymore, make me second-guess whether the simple act of enjoying my backyard was worth the hassle. Karen gasped, as if personally offended by my casual tone. "Officer, are you seriously going to allow him to continue disturbing the entire neighborhood?" She gestured wildly toward my house, as if some invisible crowd of tormented neighbors would suddenly emerge to back up her claims. But of course no one did. Because no one else cared. If anything, my other neighbors were probably peeking through their windows, shaking their heads at yet another unnecessary scene orchestrated by the Queen of Complaints. Officer Bentley sighed, flipping through a small notepad before addressing Karen again. "Ma'am, we're not here to play referee in neighborhood disputes. If there's an actual crime being committed, that's one thing. But calling us out here because someone is cooking food in their own yard? That's not our job." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Not your job," she shrieked. "So it's your job to let him ruin our community? To let him poison the air with his ridiculous barbecue smoke? To let him treat our rules like a joke?" Officer White had had enough. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm now. "I need you to stop. Right now. Unless you have a legitimate emergency, you cannot keep calling the police over trivial issues. This is not the first time you've wasted our time with these complaints, and if this continues, there will be consequences." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She hadn't expected pushback. She had probably assumed, as always, that she could badger, manipulate, and bully her way into getting what she wanted. But for once it wasn't working. She turned to me instead, her eyes narrowing into sharp slits. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed. "But this isn't over." I gave her an easy smile. "Oh, Karen, I hope it's not. Because I've got plenty of time and I'm just getting started." That was the moment she realized she had picked the wrong person to mess with. For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across her face. Just a flicker. But it was there. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. She wasn't used to losing. Officer White gave me a small nod before turning back to Karen. "We're done here," he said. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Stephen." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "And if she calls us again for something like this, she's going to regret it." Karen stomped back toward her house, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She wasn't the type to take a loss quietly. If anything, this would only make her escalate. The question was, how far was she willing to go? And how much fun was I going to have making sure she never tried this again? As the officers drove away, my guests erupted into cheers and applause. I grinned, raising my drink in a mock toast. To law and order, I said, and laughter rippled through the crowd. But as I looked over at Karen's house, where she stood at her window, glaring out like some kind of villain plotting her next move, I knew that this was only the beginning. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to make sure Karen regretted ever stepping into my backyard battlefield. The next morning, I woke up to something I had been expecting but still found infuriating. A neatly folded notice was taped to my front door, its pristine white paper practically gleaming under the morning sun. It was from the HOA, of course, and I didn't even need to open it to know what it said. Karen had wasted no time after last night's failed attempt to weaponize the police against me. She had run straight to the HOA board, probably storming in like a deranged revolutionary, demanding action, retribution, and a complete ban on all forms of backyard cooking within a 10-mile radius of her delicate nostrils. I tore open the envelope and skimmed through the carefully worded nonsense. It was the usual HOA jargon, masked under a thin veil of civility, informing me that a formal complaint had been lodged against me and that I was now required to attend a hearing regarding my repeated violations of community standards. I actually laughed out loud at that one. Violations? Of what? Being a homeowner who dared to enjoy his own property? But the best part, the part that nearly had me doubling over with laughter, was that Karen had somehow convinced them to issue a temporary suspension of my ability to host gatherings until the matter was resolved. I stood there on my porch, the paper still in my hand, shaking my head in pure disbelief. Karen wasn't just escalating. She was going for the nuclear option. She had lost the battle with the police, so now she was trying to drag me into the bureaucratic nightmare of HOA politics, where she thrived like some sort of power-hungry troll under a bridge made of fine print and arbitrary rules. I took a deep breath, stretching my neck as I weighed my options. I could fight this the easy way, lawyers, complaints of my own, the usual red tape. Or I could fight it my way. And that was when the idea struck me, a devious little plan forming in my head like the first spark of a fire. I spent the next few hours gathering every single HOA document I could find. The original agreements, the amendments, the fine print that most homeowners never bothered to read. I sat at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee, my laptop open, my printer humming as I made copies of every relevant clause that could work in my favor. I wasn't just looking for a way to beat Karen. I was looking for a way to completely dismantle her argument in a way that would leave her speechless, humiliated, and backed into a legal corner so tight that she would have no choice but to crawl back into whatever miserable little hole she had come from. By the time I was done, I had an entire folder of evidence stacked neatly on my desk. But I wasn't going to stop there. Oh no. This wasn't just about proving I was right. This was about making sure that when I walked into that HOA hearing I wouldn't just win, I would embarrass Karen so thoroughly that she would never dare to challenge me again. The day of the hearing arrived and I walked into the HOA meeting room like I owned the place. The board members sat at a long table, their expressions carefully neutral, though I could already tell some of them were dreading this whole ordeal. Karen, of course, was there too, sitting primly in her chair, her face stretched into that smug, self-righteous expression she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. I took my seat, set my folder on the table and leaned back with an easy smile. "Shall we begin?" Karen wasted no time launching into her dramatic speech. She painted me as some kind of neighborhood menace, a rogue homeowner with no regard for the sanctity of community life. She spoke about the horrors of my barbecues as if I were running an underground criminal operation instead of flipping burgers in my backyard. And then, with a flourish, she presented her so-called evidence. A collection of photographs of my grill in use, a few notes from concerned neighbors, who conveniently had chosen to remain anonymous, and a list of alleged disturbances that, if taken seriously, would make it seem like I was hosting a rock concert every weekend instead of simply cooking dinner. When she finally finished, she sat back with a satisfied smirk, clearly expecting applause or maybe even a slow clap for her theatrical performance. I waited a beat, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm before I casually flipped open my folder. "That was very dramatic, Karen," I said, scanning the board members with an amused expression. "But unfortunately for you, facts don't really care about theatrics." I started with the obvious. The HOA's own guidelines explicitly allowed backyard cooking as long as it complied with safety regulations, which I had always followed to the letter. I had photographs, timestamps, and even statements from real neighbors, ones who weren't anonymous, who confirmed that my barbecues had never caused any kind of significant disturbance. Then I pulled out the final piece of my argument, the legal precedent. HOA disputes like this had gone to court before, and every single time, rulings had been in favor of the homeowner when no actual violations were present. I cited case after case, watching as the board members' expressions shifted from neutral to mildly concerned to outright exasperated. By the time I was done, Karen's face was a mixture of rage and panic. She knew she had lost. The board deliberated for all of 2 minutes before announcing their decision. Not only was the complaint against me dismissed, but Karen was officially warned against abusing the HOA complaint system. And just to add the cherry on top, the board decided to fine her for filing false complaints. I turned to Karen as I stood, my smile never wavering. "I told you, Karen. You picked the wrong person." As I walked out of the meeting room, I could hear Karen sputtering behind me, trying to argue, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. But it was too late. The war was over. And I had won. I walked out of the HOA meeting room with my head high, the folder of evidence still clutched in my hand, but I wasn't just satisfied with winning. No, that wasn't enough. Karen had spent months trying to make my life miserable, trying to push me into submission with her constant complaints, her bogus reports, and her obsession with control. She had weaponized the HOA, wasted police resources, and even tried to turn the neighborhood against me. And now, after all that effort, she had been publicly humiliated, fined, and officially warned by the very organization she had relied on to enforce her reign of terror. But I knew Karen. I knew her type. She wasn't just going to lick her wounds and move on. No, she was going to stew in this loss, seething with resentment, waiting for her chance to strike back. I didn't intend to give her that chance. The very next day I started phase 2 of my plan. The part where I made sure Karen understood without a doubt that she had picked a fight she could never win. It began subtly. I made sure to be outside at every possible opportunity, grilling, enjoying my yard, drinking coffee on my porch with a relaxed grin whenever she walked by. I made sure to wave cheerfully every time I saw her peeking through her curtains, that ever-present scowl on her face deepening with every passing day. I started inviting neighbors over more frequently, hosting small but regular get-togethers, and the best part? Many of them actually started joining me. It turned out that a lot of people in the neighborhood had been quietly fed up with Karen's antics for years, but most had just kept their heads down, hoping to avoid her wrath. But after seeing her get shut down at the HOA meeting, something shifted. People who had been distant or neutral started coming by, some just to chat, others bringing side dishes, a few even openly laughing about the whole situation. Karen wasn't just losing her battle against me, she was losing her grip on the neighborhood. And then the final nail in the coffin. The annual HOA election was coming up, and Karen, who had been an unofficial enforcer of the rules for years, had planned to finally run for an official seat on the board. It was supposed to be her crowning achievement, the moment where she could solidify her authority and turn the entire HOA into her personal kingdom. But there was a problem. Nobody wanted to vote for her. Word had spread about her ridiculous crusade against me, and while some people were indifferent, a surprising number of neighbors were now actively against her. Some of them had started talking about how she had harassed them over minor infractions, sent passive-aggressive letters, or called the HOA for things as petty as lawn decorations being too bright. One neighbor, an older man who had lived in the community for over a decade, told me that Karen had once tried to report his grandkids for excessive laughter while they played in his backyard. The more people talked, the more stories came out, and before long, Karen had gone from being an annoying HOA busybody to a full-blown neighborhood villain. On the night of the election, the HOA clubhouse was packed. Karen sat near the front, her back stiff, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. When her name was announced as a candidate, the applause was weak, almost hesitant. And then when it was time to vote, the real humiliation began. The results weren't just a loss for Karen. They were an absolute landslide against her. She didn't just lose, she barely got any votes at all. It was the kind of crushing defeat that made it clear she had no support, no allies, and no influence left. As the meeting wrapped up, I caught Karen's eye from across the room. She looked pale, shaken, like she had finally realized just how badly she had played this game. I gave her a small, polite nod, the kind that said everything without me needing to say a word. She stormed out without speaking to anyone. Over the next few weeks, Karen's presence in the neighborhood started to fade. She stopped patrolling the streets, stopped harassing people over minor rule violations, stopped peering through her curtains like a nosy dictator. It was as if she had finally, reluctantly, accepted defeat. But the true victory came one quiet afternoon when a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. I stood on my porch, sipping a drink, watching as she loaded boxes into the moving truck. She glanced up once and saw me watching. For a split second, there was something almost human in her expression. Not just anger but exhaustion, regret, maybe even the bitter taste of realizing she had lost everything over something so petty. I raised my glass to her in a mock toast. She scowled, turned away and slammed the car door. As her car disappeared down the street, a slow clap started from across the road. Then another. And another. I turned to see my neighbors. My actual neighbors, the people who had spent years suffering under Karen's rule. Grinning, clapping, laughing. One of them raised a beer in my direction. To Stephen, he called out. The guy who finally took down the HOA's biggest menace. The cheers that followed weren't just for me. They were for the neighborhood. For every person who had been bullied by Karen. For every ridiculous fine, every passive-aggressive letter, every stupid rule that had been enforced not because it made sense, but because Karen had decided she was the boss. I grinned, taking a long sip of my drink before setting it down and walking over to my grill. All right, I said, flipping the first burger of the evening. Let's celebrate. If you were in Stephen's shoes, would you have handled the situation differently? How? What do you think was Karen's biggest mistake? At what point do you think she completely lost control? Have you ever had a real-life Karen in your neighborhood or HO? How did you handle it? The story included a mix of humor, drama, and petty revenge. Which part did you enjoy the most? Would you have preferred more of one over the others? What would you have done to get back at Karen in a creative but legal way? Do you think the HOA handled the situation fairly, or should they have acted against Karen sooner?